Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this Tech Academy session. My name is Wouter van Gielen. I'm Adobe CTO in Western Europe, and I'll be hosting today's session, which is focused on server-side data collection and personalization. Our Tech Academy series has been going on for the better part of this year. This is, I think, the sixth session by now, and we have a couple more scheduled later this year. So you'll be able to learn more about Adobe Experience Platform's query service on November 3rd and on our mobile SDK capabilities on December 6th. But today, as said before, we'll be focused on server-side data collection, a very hot topic these days, as many brands are seeking alternatives to client-side data collection. And in today's session, we'll go quite deep as to why this is important, but also on how to do that using Adobe's capabilities that have been released earlier this year. The session will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on our YouTube channel. You can find the YouTube channel by scanning the QR code on your screen, and my colleague Clément, who is monitoring the chatbots, will post the URL of this channel as well in the chats. So before we get started, one last question. So if you have any questions yourself, please put them in the Q&A section in Zoom. So don't put them in the chat, but put them in the Q&A, and it's easier for Clément and myself to keep track of questions and answers in that way. Good. So without further ado, let's get started. Obviously, the topic that all of us are caring for are one-to-one experiences. Designing and delivering exceptional customer experiences these days requires you as an organization to be able to build these experiences in an omnichannel way, which means that you collect data in real time, not just only on the website and the mobile application, but also in the call center, also in the point of sales environments, and many other environments can be used to speak to a customer and as such collect data about that customer. And that data needs to be available in real time. So real time, I guess there's many definitions about real time. Depending on who you speak to, it will range from milliseconds to minutes to hours to potentially even days. But for good understanding in today's session, we'll speak about latencies in the milliseconds. That's about 200 and 300 milliseconds response time, which is as fast as a blink of an eye. That's the kind of speed that is required for experiences to be delivered and personalized. Obviously, it needs to be consistent. So if you show me a message or a call to action or an offer on the website, that same offer needs to be shown to me on a mobile application, but also in the call center by the service agents, and also even on the point of sales ticket that is maybe printed out after purchasing something offline. And the last thing, if you do this properly, and obviously you have the ability to bring context to those experiences. An interaction with the call center should lead to a change in communication on the website and vice versa. Every interaction is important and needs to be collected in real time. That's a general introduction to the topic of experiences. To make this possible in multiple environments, brands have been seeking for alternatives to the typical client-side data collection. We'll have a look at the whiteboard in a couple of seconds, but in general, client-side data collection is what most of us have been doing for the last 10, 15, 20 years. But, well, it's not really the most optimal way of collecting data, and it's more and more impacted by limitations such as ITP by Apple and the third-party cookies that eventually will go away. They should have gone already, but as you know as well, it's only happening in 2024, but it gives you a bit more time. But still, moving to a server-side data collection approach is quite useful. And many brands, especially in the financial services industries, have been asking us this question for a long time. How can I collect data in a secure way, server-side, without having to implement, as an example, Adobe SDKs, Adobe JavaScript on my website or in my mobile application? And well, in today's session, we'll focus on that specifically. Before I get started with the whiteboard, I just wanted to make it a bit interactive this session. So I've got a survey that I would like to show you. So if you could maybe take out your mobile phones and scan this QR code on the screen, or else if you're in the web browser, just go to menti.com and you can use the code 6298-9681 to basically start answering a couple of basic questions. You need to understand where you are coming from, what kind of interest you have, and that will help me, I would say, focus on the right things in this session. So once you've scanned the QR code, I'll just show you a couple of questions. So the first question is this one: which Adobe solutions are you using today? Adobe Experience Platform, Analytics, Target, Audience Manager, or none? That would be very helpful for you to answer this question. Okay, let me wait 10 more seconds and then go to the next one. Good, so many of you are using Adobe Analytics and Adobe Experience Platform. Nobody answered Target or Audience Manager. It's fine. If you look at data collection today, how are you collecting data from that website? Are you using legacy at measurements? Are you using Adobe Launch, Google Tag Manager, or Telium IQ, or any other strategy? Oh, I see a comment from Praveen. You can only select one solution. Okay, I can't change that now, so sorry for that. I'll get it fixed for the next session. Good. Next question is about data collection in the mobile application. So how are you collecting data in the mobile application? Are you using the older Adobe Mobile Services SDKs? Are you using the most recent mobile SDK for Edge as released last year? Maybe you aren't sending data to Adobe, that's also an option. And then any other tag managers. Good. It's clear, mixed view. Next question is, how are you personalizing the website today? Client-side applications like Adobe Target or Optimizely, Google Optimize, and so on. We don't personalize the website is also unfortunately something that still happens. Server-side tools or other. I don't see anybody answering this question with the server-side tools option, which is interesting, and we'll focus a bit on how you can then make use of the Edge API to make that possible. Good. Next question. How important are page load times for your organization? Answer this honestly. Not everybody cares about this. It would be good to know what your view is on this. I guess there's peer pressure now to answer the middle answer. Thank you for that. Good. Do your developers like to use third-party SDKs, maybe mainly in the mobile application context? Yes, no. Yes or no is the option. For most of them. So nobody loves it, that's clear. Luckily, we have a better approach to make this possible. The next question is about server-side data collection. So how important is server-side data collection to you today, but also tomorrow? Is it actually a thing for you? Are you focusing on doing things differently? Yeah. Curious to see what you think. Good. So thank you for that. I hope you found the answers helpful. Let's continue with the last question, which is focused on third-party cookie limitations. Do you have a solution for that already? Yes or no? Okay, so a clear answer there. Many people are still exploring options. There are multiple options depending on obviously who you speak to. People have opinions and so on. In today's session, we'll focus on Adobe's FP-ID, first party ID, which was part of a Tech Academy session earlier this year. And we've implemented this for today's session as well in a in a server-side environment with a HTTP only cookie setting, which I'll get into it in a couple of minutes. Good, thank you for answering those questions. Let's continue. If you've seen the sessions before, you've seen that I have a tendency to like whiteboarding to explain my story. So today we're focused on data collection, and I would say today, and for most of you, this is how data collection is happening. On the website, you basically have a tag manager, which is using JavaScript, obviously, to do what it does, to place cookies, to send events from the website to various applications. And all of these requests are being sent one by one. And you can see this quite easily in just about any websites. If I, as an example, change the screen to this secure financial website, which is Adobe's demo brand for financial services, and if I open up the network view in the browser, and you'll see all of these lovely little text behind me. By refreshing the page, you'll see a whole bunch of requests being sent. You'll see, as an example, these interact calls behind me, which are the requests sent by Adobe's Tag Manager launch using Web SDK to send data to Adobe. But well, there are multiple more requests being sent by this page. And well, this is the topic of today, of course. Also, when you have a look at the cookies being set in this environment, you can see multiple cookies being dropped here. The main one with Adobe's Edge data collection is this conductor cookie, which contains the identity, which is basically an encoded Experience Cloud ID. We'll go a bit deeper on this in a couple of minutes, but this base64 string basically represents the identifier, and this ID currently in Google Chrome works just like it used to be. But if you would have the same website open in Safari, then this cookie would obviously be impacted by settings in Safari, which would remove this cookie quite quickly. At the latest, after 7 days, it would be gone. So that's the way data collection is currently happening. And the same thing can be said for mobile applications. If you look in the mobile application world, you typically have an SDK. So most of you had some sort of SDK implemented in the application. Some of you are still on the old one. Some have the new one, but the concept is the same. You've got this block of code which is running, which is sending requests, which is taking care of identity management, and as such is collecting an ECID for Adobe and storing that in the mobile application context. But also it's keeping track of IDFA and GAID and many other identifiers that are being used. Anyway, this is the situation today. This data collection concept of client-side collection isn't the fastest. So in general, if you care about page load times, and all 22 of you answered that question with yes, we care about this, then obviously there's optimization, constant optimization needed to make this possible. But also when you think about personalization, wanting to change the image on the home page as an example, wanting to show an offer, etc. It's also subject to latency, to potentially even flicker on the website, on the web page, because the response from the backend solution takes too much time to provide the image back to the front end. Yeah, not the best experience, and quite complicated to manage in a client-side environment. Security-wise, obviously, there's also something to be said. Data leakage is quite common, and many organizations are sending data back to the client side, to the front ends, without properly considering what they're doing, and as such, they are leaking their customer data. And in today's landscape, that's unforgivable. If you make a mistake with customer data, it's quite easy to lose the trust of your customer, which has taken potentially years to build. But also with increasing limitations, as discussed before, third-party cookies, Apple's ITP, and so on, limits your ability to basically track a customer. So when you think about a customer profile, which is required for one-to-one experiences, you need an identifier that is consistent today, tomorrow, in 8 days, but also hopefully in a couple of months from now. So to do all of this properly, a different approach is needed. And if I focus specifically on the mobile application context, as said before, most of the developers that I've met in the last couple of years, they tell me that this SDK is a no-go. I don't want to implement an SDK that I don't know or don't understand or don't control myself. And as such, Adobe gives me a different way of collecting data. So today we'll go into that. So server-side is the way forward for many organizations. It has a couple of benefits. Obviously, it's fast, given that you have a different runtime environment to control all of the requests. This allows you to be faster. Also, when it's about personalization, showing a different image on the website, showing a different offer on the website, and so on, is easier if you manage this server side. So it gives you total control on everything that happens. It's much more secure, and there's no data leakage, or at least less chances to make mistakes that will cause your data to be leaked. And in the end, it gives you a certain independence from browsers, because the implementation that you have in this example will also make it possible to collect data in an omnichannel environment. So if you have a website and a mobile application and the point of sales environment and the call center environment, all of them will be able to use the same server-side environment to collect data, which will give you much more consistency over time. And also specifically for the identity problem, implementing a first-party ID strategy using Adobe's FPID is well easier in this server-side environment. So we'll go a bit deeper step by step. Let me first go back to this website again. And this is the before situation. This is what most of you are doing today. Websites are loading. These calls are being sent from the website to a backend system. And if you have a look at that payload, just make it a bit more beautiful for you to see. This is a typical request that is sent by a website to Adobe. So under the XDM object, you'll find all of the data that's being sent by the website to the client side. And what you'll see next is that we're going to take the same context and the same syntax and send data to Adobe server side, which means that you'll have to, well, you'll see a couple of changes when it comes to data collection in that process. Let's change the screen again. So this is a secure financial website, which looks the same as this one. This one is running in Chrome, and it's using the legacy data collection methods. But this website is running in Safari currently on my MacBook. And it's a bit different because this website is being compiled completely by the server side. So in the move from client side to server side, there are multiple steps you can take. Obviously, making the data collection agnostic from the tool and more generic for you as an organization is the way forward. But also more and more organizations are shifting to a fully dynamic website being generated server side, which means that client side, nothing happens anymore except loading the website and sending variables as key value pairs to a server-side backend, which that organization controls completely. And then on that server-side environment, we basically compile the HTML that is supposed to be shown to the customer. So if I open up my developer console over here as well, and refresh the page, you'll see a similar thing happening, except in this case, there are much fewer calls, and basically most of them, this is a jQuery JavaScript. These are images being loaded, and we only have one specific request that is currently being sent. Let me put myself a bit to the side. So you've got this request being sent by the website to a specific endpoint, which this is using. This is a first-party endpoint. It's basically the same domain name is being used in that process. And if you look at the storage in Safari, you'll see that under cookies, there's only one cookie. This is not an Adobe cookie. This is just a first-party ID. This is a user ID generated by, in this case, Secure Financial, which in theory, on the first step, has nothing to do with any other solution. So it's not an Adobe specific identifier. I'll show you in a minute how this is being generated. But this is a cookie which is different from the ones that you typically have on websites. This is a server set cookie. And it's basically an HTTP only cookie, which means that this cookie is not accessible in the client-side context. So no application can access this cookie, no application can read the cookie. It's a fully server-side cookie, which makes sure that you as an organization have a consistent way to identify me as a customer going forwards. And also this unique user ID and the way it is being set is not subject to Apple's ITP currently, which means that this cookie will be persistent beyond the 7-day time frame. And that gives you the ability to basically track this customer, have a consistent profile about your customer. And also, if you look at the usage of Adobe solutions downstream, you will have a consistent profile counts in tools like Adobe Analytics. And you'll have a consistent customer profile, which you can then use to personalize this customer experience consistently going forward. I'll dive a bit deeper step by step in the way this was implemented. But I would like to first show you a login action. So obviously, I'm simulating a login here. I'm going to pick up a backend loyalty ID just to show you. This is Adobe Experience Platform that you can see behind me. I'm going to load a customer profile based on the loyalty ID. And this is the one that I just copied. This is my good friend, Kevin De Bruyne. This is his CRM profile in Adobe Experience Platform. So you can see quite a basic profile. Obviously, this is a demonstration. But this profile was loaded, preloaded from the backend systems. If I take this into a very specific example, Secure Financial might be using Salesforce CRM in the backend, and they would upload their customer profiles inside Adobe Experience Platform. And in this case, this profile of Kevin De Bruyne has got two different identities, one CRM ID and one loyalty ID. But currently, there's no mention of any client-side device identifier yet. So we're going to change that. So by copying this loyalty ID and going back to my website over here, I'll basically simulate a login action. So by clicking login, this parameter is now being sent by the website to my server-side backend, which is running on AWS. And from there, we are basically sending that same identity back into Adobe Experience Platform. And if all goes well, let me just refresh this page. Then you should be seeing additional identities. So there you go. So in this case, you are seeing that on top of the CRM ID and the loyalty ID, you are now seeing an Experience Cloud ID. So probably you're thinking, why is there an ECID there? So I'll explain that in a minute. But basically, on the website, we had a first-party customer identity. So this unique user ID generated by Secure Financial as a bank. and they've basically sent this ID to Adobe server side. Now, Adobe doesn't store this FP ID or this unique user ID. Instead, Adobe translates this into a mapping table whereby each first-party ID basically has got a ECID attached to it. This ECID is Adobe's identity inside the Adobe ecosystem. But the thing here is that this ECID isn't needed, it's not required to be available client-side for data collection. And as such, we have a consistent way to identify the customer on a specific device without being reliant on the typical ECID cookie that's being dropped there. And instead, the identity is managed by the brand itself using a first-party ID. I'll go back into the whiteboard in a minute just to show you each step involved here. But in the end, Kevin De Bruyne's profile is now a bit richer than it was. You can now see that events have been collected against Kevin De Bruyne's profile. So you can see these page views from the website of the Secure Financial homepage being popping up inside the platform. And it also, from a personalization perspective, we have the ability to personalize the website in the front end. When I refresh the page here, you're now suddenly seeing this Secure Financial blue cards banner popping up on the homepage. This is an offer, a next best offer for Kevin De Bruyne. So based on the relationship between Kevin De Bruyne and Secure Financial, a next best offer for this credit card was defined for him specifically. And in the communication between the server-side backends and Adobe Experience Platform, we basically provided that offer to that server-side backend, which then compiled the HTML and then basically delivered this specific website so that Kevin De Bruyne could see it. Additionally, if I scroll all the way down, you can see this, we made it simple, tailor-made mortgage quotes banner. This banner is being served by Adobe Targets, which is Adobe's personalization solution for the website environment. However, still, when you have a look at the network requests, just refresh the page, in these network requests, you can still only see that one single request being sent to my server-side backends and nothing else. So no Adobe Target, no other JavaScript on the website. Everything is happening completely server-side in this specific implementation. So before I open up AWS and show you all of how all of this was implemented, let me just go back here. The legacy implementation that you have seen using the Secure Financial brands was basically collecting. So from the website, it had implemented a specific SDK. SDK was speaking to the edge for data collection, and upon the first request, we basically received back that ECID, and subsequently, the client side was sending all of the page views to the edge. The edge is Adobe's data collection environment. It's a real-time network of servers that are distributed globally. And this edge is the single entry point into the Adobe ecosystem. So as data hits the edge over here, that same data can then be sent to Adobe solutions, but also to non-Adobe solutions using Adobe's event forwarding capability. Anyway, this is the legacy way, the old way, which still requires client-side code to be there. But obviously, that's not the way we want to move forward. So the way forward looks a bit like this, whereby the website basically is sending GET requests. Sending GET requests into an AWS backend. This is an AWS API gateway, which you'll see in a minute. This API gateway setup is speaking to an AWS Lambda function. So upon the first time of loading that specific website, a check was done to see if that website, that Safari browser, was already identified by a first-party ID. That wasn't the case. So the first thing to do here is generate that specific ID and send it back to the front end so that it could be stored in that HTTP only server-side cookie. The same process applies to a mobile application. I'll simulate this with Postman API calls in a minute. But inside the mobile application, you also need to collect that first-party ID, and that happens through a post request into my Lambda function, which then replies back into the app with that specific identity. And once we've set that specific FPID in the context of this device, then the server-side backend on AWS Lambda basically has the ability to send events from the company-owned server-side environments into Adobe's Edge and the full Adobe data collection ecosystem. So there's a couple of steps to take into account here. First of all, Adobe speaks XDM. So XDM is our experience data model that is used inside the platform, but also by other solutions. So the data that's sent there needs to comply to XDM standards, or alternatively, it can be mapped upon ingestion as well. But in this case, we basically prepared the XDM payload inside the Lambda function. With the XDM payload prepared, then obviously you have the ability to invoke the Edge API. Invoking the Edge API, you'll see this in the Lambda function in a minute. But from make this very technical, this is a tech academy, so I have to be technical. So in this Postman environment, you can see an Edge network server request. So this server request goes to the server.adobedc.net endpoint. It contains a reference to a data stream. A data stream is basically the specific endpoint that you have defined at the Edge level. And then inside that request, you can find the XDM payload. In this case, it's a nice JSON payload that was prepared. And the server endpoint also requires authentication. So if you're familiar with Adobe, you will use Adobe I/O to set up a project. And using that project, you basically generate a specific JSON Web Token. And then this token is then used by the Edge Network Server API as authorization to speak to that specific endpoint. And long story short, when I click the send button, then you get this response. And this response contains everything that the Edge has available about this customer. You'll see me talk about three things in this session from a personalization perspective. The first thing is segments. So in this payload over here, you can see the segments that qualify for a specific customer. As an example, we have a couple of brands who have implemented this specific parts of the Edge to power personalization towards DSP networks. So they're basically exchanging segment IDs inside the mobile application context. And they use this response to make it possible to pass the segments that qualify for a customer to a different solution in the client-side environment. Secondly, and this is quite technical, but again, this is a Tech Academy session. In here, you'll find the response from offer decisioning. Inside Adobe, we offer customers the ability to define next best offers. So in this payload, you can see the offer that currently qualifies for me as a customer, which contains the delivery URL. And in this case, that's an image file, which can then be used to show on the website or any other channel. And then lastly is Adobe Target. So depending on which solutions you are using, if you have Adobe Target, then you'll see something similar as part of the response. An Adobe Target object. And in this object, you will find the specific activity that is being used that applies to the specific customer. And then in the data object, you'll see, again, in this case, the HTML that needs to be shown to this customer. So the Edge API requires you to send an XDM payload to it. It then gives you a response which contains personalization information, and then you can take that information and personalize a website or application or anything else. Going back to the whiteboard, so you've seen me invoke that Edge API request through Postman. In a minute, I'll show you the implementation in Lambda. But basically, this was a request that I was sending. And then immediately the response is sent by the Edge. And as I was referring to before, in this request, you're basically sending that first-party ID. That first-party ID is something that you as an organization have generated. That FPID should remain within your ecosystem as much as possible. So what do we do at our Edge level? We basically build this mapping table. And in that mapping table, you will find the FPID that you have sent us, and then the ECID that we have generated for it. So as of this moment, when the data, the first request hits the Adobe endpoint using this specific FPID, we map it against the 123 ECID, and then inside in the communication by the Edge through the various Adobe solutions, it will use that ECID of 123 to identify the customer going forward. So everything that sits outside the Edge will use FPID. Everything that sits into the Adobe ecosystem will use the ECID to identify the customer going forward. Okay, so with that mapping done, with the communication inside the Adobe ecosystem happening with millisecond latency, you'll basically see that segments qualify at the Edge in real time, that offers qualify at the Edge in real time, and that experience targeting activities powered by Adobe Target all qualify in real time at the Edge. And as such, they are ingested into that response back to the caller. In my example with Postman, you've seen it in Postman. The same thing will apply to AWS, whereby you'll see all of this response be handled inside that server-side function. And using the response, we can then apply personalization server-side, which in the end results in, as an example, in HTML being compiled server-side, and then sending back that HTML from the Edge towards the website, whereby the only thing that happens is basically showing the HTML client side. So all of this happens extremely fast. So that's a latency of 200 to 300 milliseconds in general. And that's fast enough for page load times. It's fast enough for personalization. And the big benefit here is that there's very little dependency on anything that happens client side. There's no more mention of JavaScript over here. There's no more mention of SDKs over here. So as an organization, you have much more control and flexibility as to how you basically collect that data and personalize the response. And so if I go back to my example from a bank, if I want to personalize the experience in my mobile bank application, you basically, so many banks have this approach whereby inside the app, you will see your balance and you will see all of your different checking accounts and so on. And inside that application as well, they will define a specific offer location. That offer location is configured to receive dynamic payloads from Adobe. And that specifically in this mobile application context is what happens when the response over here is basically generated. It can also generate a JSON payload, and that JSON payload is then basically sent back into the mobile application. It is handled inside the application, which then means that the offer text would be inserted in the specific offer placement inside the application with no dependency on Adobe SDKs in that specific application environment. I'll get back to the whiteboard in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to quickly highlight and show you the backend here. Very simple insights. Amazon. By the way, we are using Amazon in this example because it's one way of doing it, but the same process can be implemented using Google Cloud Platform with Google Functions, or with Microsoft Azure with Azure Functions, and so on. So it's not really specific to AWS. Any kind of server-side application can be used to do what I am about to show you. So in this Amazon environment, we basically have got a get method and a post method. The get method is used by the website. So whenever this website is loading, it is basically sending a get request, as you can see over here, into that specific API gateway endpoints. In this implementation, we're also sending things like a page name and the loyalty ID as query string parameters. And this is just for a demo flow. In reality, you would have a different encrypted way to communicate that data to that server-side backend. But as soon as this method is executed by requesting that page, it basically sends that request into my Lambda function. So this is the Lambda function that's made available. And by the way, I will share a link to a Git repo which contains all of this so that you can see it and potentially reuse it. Don't question my coding skills. I'm a very basic coder. There's definitely room for optimization in this function, but it works, and so I'm very happy that it works. So in this function, we define things like the bearer token, the data stream ID, and obviously the bearer token would be loaded dynamically as it needs to refresh every 24 hours at the minimum. But then when this Lambda function gets triggered by loading the website client side, there's a couple of checks that happen. And you can see a first check here, which basically verifies whether or not the cookie is available. So that's the cookie containing the first party ID. If I open up the logs here to show you, you'll then see that this request automatically contains the server-side cookies as well. This is just from a couple of minutes ago. Let me just refresh. So in this log, this is the request that we receive by the Safari browser. In this Safari browser, we've got a server-side cookie, and this cookie contains the unique user ID of the specific user. And based on this, on the presence of this variable, we will then decide how to proceed. So inside the code over here, you'll see the checks on that specific code. It will verify if it's a true unique user ID, because there's a requirement to be met for the unique user ID standards. And once this ID is available, we will basically create that page view event. If I scroll down and basically zoom out, show you like this. This is the create body page view function. In here, we basically have got the post body prepared. This is the Adobe XDM data model that you can see again. Obviously, we're taking the couple of variables from the incoming request, like the page name and the URL. And with that basic payload defined, we are basically ready to start sending it. So that sending is a different function, a bit lower. In this function, we basically attach the FPID in the identity map. So in this case, in this implementation with FPID, it is advised to use identity map object to place the FPID in it, which will then trigger the mapping table that I was just showing before on the whiteboards. It will create that mapping table between the FPID and the ECID. If loyalty ID is available, then of course we'll also send it to the platform. And with as you could see in the demo, with Kevin De Bruyne's loyalty ID available, you could see the mapping table be enriched. And as such, this profile was basically built containing the various identities in an immersed profile kind of environment. One last thing here to mention specifically. Whenever you want to do personalization, you need to provide a scope of that decision back to the Adobe environment. In this case, we've got two different decision scopes being sent. The first one refers to offer decisioning. This is the one that is responsible for requesting the next best offer for this customer to the Adobe ecosystem. And then the second one is a decision scope for Adobe Target, which refers to an M-box for those who are aware of Adobe Target and how it works. And with these two parameters in place, we are basically telling the Edge, give me a decision for offer decisioning and for Adobe Target as part of the response back into me. And then the last thing from a technical setup perspective to be aware of is this request that is sent to the host name of server.adobe.tc.net. You've got this interact endpoint, which is used for synchronous calls for one-to-one customer behavior. And then also a second endpoint, which is a collect endpoint for batch use cases, whereby you can send multiple events in one go. But obviously in this environment, if you want to do personalization, then it will be this interact endpoint whereby the response will be given immediately. So with the request being sent, we've basically handled the data collection side of all of this, but we haven't tackled the personalization side yet. And that's crucial to properly understand. This is not just about data collection. There are multiple ways to collect data from the website and the mobile application. But what we're trying to achieve here is personalization in a server-side environment as well. So we need to have this personalization decision immediately, so quick enough in time for the web page to be loaded in front of the customer. So as this event is being sent to the Edge, we basically receive a response payload, and then we are parsing this response payload. So you can find, in this case, we are collecting the delivery URL of the next best offer. If you scroll down a bit, we're focusing on Adobe Target and collecting the Adobe Target HTML. And with that response received into this function, we can then basically compile the HTML and send it back to the website. And that happens over here. So this is not the same thing as a CMS. This is a very limited demo implementation, but a very functional one, because you've got your full HTML being compiled in this server-side function. And in here, you'll find references to variables like the offer content.image, which comes back from the Edge, like the Adobe Target HTML, which comes back from the Edge. And then with the HTML completely available, you basically send it back to the caller, to the website. But also as part of this specific response to the client-side environment, we are setting that server set cookie. Many of you have asked me, but also my colleagues, questions on first-party IDs and how to set these identities. In the case of API Gateway with AWS Lambda, this is one way of doing it. You basically provide the set cookie instruction back to the API Gateway environment. You specify what the specific unique user ID is, and then you can set things like same site equals strict to ensure that the cookie cannot be used for any other purposes. HTTP only flag makes sure that the cookie can't be read by anybody else client side. And then obviously the domain limitation as well. And the expiry dates can be set here. With these cookies, you have the ability to set expiration up to 2 years, so that this cookie can remain consistent up to 2 years. Obviously, if the user deletes the cookie, then of course the identity will be gone. So that the end user, the customer, is always in control of what happens and if this cookie eventually will persist or not. But with this implementation under the proper consent, you are doing everything you can to guarantee data collection, consistent profile counts, and consistent customer profiles as much as you can. And with this response then being sent back to the front ends, you basically have got your HTML being displayed in a very dynamic way. So no static website, everything happens potentially server side. You can include multiple of these placements, as we call them. And in this case, the secure financial blue cards is one placement, but in theory, you can have 5, 10, 15 different placements at the same time. And with that, basically have a fully dynamic website delivered with a millisecond latency to the front end. I'll open it up for questions in a minute. I just wanted to highlight once again that this implementation makes it possible to not just collect data, but also personalize in the same response. So Adobe Target, offer decisioning, and edge segmentation all make it possible to provide instructions back to the server-side environment or directly to the client side. So that's quite useful. Also, if you think about the fact that it's not just for website, but also for mobile applications, for the call center, for the point of sales environments, for whatever environment you can think of, this will make it quite consistent from an implementation perspective. And instead of doing it like you're doing today with a very bespoke custom implementation for every channel, which is very different from each other, and you can basically streamline that and do it all in one and the same way through a server-side environment, which your IT and team and developers control completely. From a use case perspective, I think I've mentioned most of these already, but website and mobile app personalization can happen faster with more flexibility and less wait time. If you think about the point of sales environment, we actually have a point of sale, a grocery retail customer in Europe, which has connected their point of sales terminals to Adobe Experience Platform, and they are showcasing the next best offer of a customer on the point of sales still while the customer is scanning their groceries, and they will also include it on the receipts. So that's quite useful from an implementation perspective. If you are a telco organization and you provide your customers with set-top boxes or any other IoT device, can also customize the appearance of the HTML delivered inside those devices. So again, making sure that personalization happens in a consistent way, not just on the website and the application, but everywhere else. And the same thing for call center environments. If I'm calling your call center and I'm speaking to a service agent, and this person is making me an offer, then that offer needs to be completely aligned to the same offer that I would get on the website, in the application, etc. And when I stop my conversation with the service agent in the call center, that interaction, that event needs to be sent back from the call center into the Adobe ecosystem for optimization of offers and personalization. And the way to do that is also to use that same server-side function in the process. So that's more or less what I wanted to address. Let's open it up for questions. Let me first check with Clément. Clément, are there any outstanding questions?
Hey, Wouter. I think the chat pod, the chat has been disabled, so some links could not be shared. That would be interesting to share them maybe. And yes, there are some open questions regarding, for example, the use of the mobile SDK. Is it still worth using the mobile SDK, or should that be replaced with custom calls to AWS Lambda functions, for example?
Yep. So I would not advise to not implement mobile SDK anymore, because they are two different patterns which support the same use cases. There's a clear benefit of the server-side environments. That's clear. I think that's clear from my explanation. But many customers are still using mobile SDKs as well. The big difference here is that the mobile SDK offers more or less out-of-the-box capabilities to set identities, to collect identities, and to send events and provide personalization inside the application. So that's easy. It's easier and quicker to implement it that way, as there's no dependency on a server-side backend which needs to be developed and maintained. But I would say the future-proof approach, if you have the proper development team available, would be to focus on the server-side environments. And especially if you're a bank, if you're in the financial services industry, then I would definitely advise you to take into account the routes to implement the Edge Network Server API. I've been involved in numerous implementations of Adobe technology in FSI environments. A common discussion has been how do you do this in a personal private customer zone when the customer is authenticated in their private customer zone, because that's really a very sensitive environment and you don't want any third-party trackers or code or JavaScript in that environment. Well, this is the answer to that specific question. In the same case, mobile applications for banks are also quite sensitive because, again, your financial data is available there, and it's not so uncommon for things to go wrong if you have third-party data or third-party trackers in there. So this is, again, a more secure way to handle this. Yeah, that's what I would advise for financial services. So I'm gonna mark this question as answered. Then I see a question from Floriana. Is a hybrid option possible, recommended? Client side for tracking and server side for testing personalization. It's possible, definitely possible. We have customers who had a legacy implementation with Adobe Analytics and have chosen to keep using that for data ingestion into the broader Adobe ecosystem, and at the same time have implemented a different path to collect the personalization instructions. It is possible to do it that way, although I would say the preferred option going forwards, the long-term plan should always be to have one single approach to make things clear and consistent. I'll mark the question as well. Praveen has a question of whether or not AWS components, whether to expect it in the Azure catalog or not. I'm not completely sure what you mean. We currently are not working on any components or out-of-the-box connectors inside AWS or GCP. So currently this would be a custom implementation similar to what I just implemented, but probably a bit more sophisticated than what I had. Good. Can one use the same concept using Giga ID and MuleSoft for FPID creation? Yes, the FPID is something that is generated by every organization without taking into account anything that Adobe needs to do. Adobe isn't really concerned in the creation of the FPID, and every organization needs to have their own process of generating it. That means you can also decide how you seed that specific ID, and if you can make it a combination of multiple identities that in the end gets translated into the default unique user ID format, then that would work properly as well. So Clément, if you could mark that one as answer as well. Then how is consent management handled at this stage? So consent management is should always be handled before any data is collected. You might have missed it on the demo, but there was a catch-all cookie banner. Clearly, that's not the way forward. There needs to be a much more granular consent level provided by the customer, which you would then collect in your server-side environments. And based on the settings of the customer, so if they have decided that they don't want data to be tracked for analytics or personalization use cases, then obviously you would not be sending that event to Adobe, and you would also not be personalizing the websites based on anything from Adobe, because the customer would not have consented to that. Okay, so how to plan the custom implementation to the server side. I'm not sure if we have any BRDs available for this implementation currently. That's something to check. I think, Praveen, if you have questions about the specific projects, it would be good if you could reach out to me directly, or else to your account team or consulting team that you're working with, to ask for their inputs. Just for context, the Edge Network Server API was released into production in beginning of April this year. So that's just 4 or 5 months ago. So I'm not sure if it's already part of the default implementation documentation, but just feel free to contact me or your account team to find out how we can help you in your specific requests. And then a question from Keith. A question from Keith. We've tried to connect SDK and our existing build with AEM, but have had problems with third-party tags. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm able to answer that, Keith, without knowing the context of your implementation. There's no reason why there would be a system limitation onto this. And this would be an implementation thing. Again, I'm happy to assist with this. If you reach out to me directly, I can help you find the answer to your problem in your specific context. Then one more question from Julio. Julio is asking if it's possible to have server-side for application and browser data collection for website running at the same time. Of course, it's up to you to decide what you implement where. I can see many customers who have an immediate need for this in the mobile application context, as it will help streamline data collection in there, and who are still relying on the traditional way of doing things client-side on the website. So there's no obligation to change everything at the same time. You can combine everything just as you see fit based on your specific requirements and implementation. And then thank you, Praveen, for the comments. I'm always happy to help. Good. I see we've answered all of the questions. Okay. There will be a post-event email that will be sent out later today, which contains the recording of today's session, but also which contains a number of interesting links to our YouTube channel, to various other documentation on Experience League for this topic of today. Again, thanks a lot for your time today. It's always interesting and fun to see all of you connect. I hope you find it useful and learned something new today. And I'll look forward to seeing you again on November 3rd for our query service session. Thanks a lot and have a great day.